Chapter 35 of The Winning of Barbara Worth by Harold Bell Wright. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 35, Nature and Human Nature. 2 weeks after the victory of Willard Holmes in the River War, the engineer arrived in Republic on the evening train from the city by the sea. At the hotel, he was quickly surrounded by the pioneer citizens who were eager to greet him with expressions of appreciation for his work. But it was Horace P. Blanton who did the talking. Horace P., in his brave picture general hat, his impressively swelling front of white vest, and his black clerical tie, was the personification of economic, financial, and scholastic, not to say ecclesiastic, dignity. His greeting of the engineer was majestic, but as a royal sovereign might welcome the returning general of his conquering armies with sadness at the thought of the lives his victories had cost, the countenance of Horace P. expressed a noble grief. "Willard," he said, his voice charged with emotion, "I congratulate you. You are the savior of this Imperial King's Basin. When we saw that Greenfield's company was not able to handle the awful situation, I told my friend, the general manager, and our other officials of the S&C that they must come to the rescue without an instant's delay, and that you must be put in charge of the work. I knew that if any man on earth could stop that river, you could. So we decided to let you go ahead. You have justified my confidence nobly, Willard. You certainly have. I'm proud of you, old man. I am indeed." The engineer tried manfully to appreciate the spirit of the speaker's words. With that white vest and black tie before him, to say nothing of the picture hat that crowned the massive head, it was impossible for Holmes not to wish that he could appreciate Horace P. Blanton's spirit. It hungered so for appreciation. "I'm very grateful to you, Mr. Blanton," said the engineer, "but really I feel that you overestimate my part in the work. Not at all, my dear boy. I knew my man, and I was not disappointed. But the cost," he shook his kingly head sorrowfully and heaved a majestic sigh. "Confidentially, Willard, I estimate that the financial cost of Greenfield and myself alone were close on to $1 million. I haven't a thing left. Wiped me out clean." Holmes looked really sympathetic. He knew that every dollar that Horace P. Blanton ever spent was a dollar belonging to someone else. But even mythical losses of mythical property, when suffered by Horace P., demanded sympathy. The man in the white vest felt them so keenly and strove with such noble courage to bear them bravely. Encouraged by the engineer's interest and the presence of the little crowd of pioneers, the speaker continued, "When I saw our beautiful town, the town that we had built with our own hands, falling in ruins into that terrible chasm, I cried like a baby, sir." Even as he spoke, his eyes filled with manly tears which he made no attempt to hide. Then he lifted his majestic bulk grandly and looked about with kingly countenance. "But I shall stay with it, Willard. I shall stay and help these people to regain their losses. We can't desert them now. If my creditors will give me a little time, and I am sure they will, not a man shall lose a penny, no matter what it costs me." The sentence was a bit ambiguous, but it was a noble resolution, worthy of such a lofty soul. At this moment a boy with the evening papers approached the group. "Here, son, my paper," called Horace P. The boy gripped his wares with a firm hand. "I got to have my money first. You ain't done nothing but promise for a month." "Boy, give me my paper. You shall have your money tomorrow," he thundered from the depths beneath the white vest. The boy backed away. "That doesn't do it. I can't live on hot air." With an imperial air, as if tremendous stakes hung upon the trivial incident, the great man said to Holmes, "Excuse me, Willard. I must see about this," and with a firm and determined step he left the hotel. A hush fell upon the company of pioneers. Not one of them but would have gladly, had he dared, offered the outraged monarch the price of a paper. The Kings Basin settlers were proud of Horace P. But that night Horace P. Blanton boarded the northbound train and was never seen in the Kings Basin again. His creditors, and they are many, from the newsboy to the hotel manager, the barber, the laundry agent, the liveryman, and bootblack, are still giving him time, as he was confident that they would. The pioneers miss him sorely, but they manage to struggle along without him, living perhaps in the hope that he will some day come back. In the silence that followed the passing of Horace P., Willard Holmes slipped away from the group of men and approached the manager of the Kings Basin Land and Irrigation Company, who was sitting alone with his cigar in a far corner of the room. "Hello, old man," was Burke's greeting as the engineer approached. The thoughtful manager of the company had been an interested observer of his friend's reception and of the newspaper incident. As the two men shook hands, the manager's cigar shifted to one corner of his mouth, and his head tipped toward the opposite shoulder. "How much did Horace P. touch you for, Willard?" "I gave him my admiration and sympathy." The other shook his head wonderingly. "A special providence watches over you, my son." After that, nothing could have saved your pocketbook if that kid had not been sent by your guardian angel to your rescue. "When did you leave the river?" "Last week. The S&C called me into the city. I'm on my way back to the work now." "What's the news?" Burke grinned. "The first train over the Kings Basin Central went out this morning with a special party of distinguished citizens, Jefferson Worth, the seer, Abe Lee, and Miss Worth. The lady will spend a week or two in the town of Barba and with friends in the South Central District. Texas Joe and Pat left this morning in a rig, leading Miss Worth's saddle horse, El Capitan. It's all in the Kings Basin Messenger." He handed the paper to Holmes, who mechanically stuffed it into his pocket. "How's Uncle Jim?" "He's at the office, I think. You know, he's winding up the affairs of the poor old KBL&I." "So I understand." The two men were silent for a moment. Then Burke said thoughtfully, "It's hard lines for the company, Willard, but the mules, including your humble servant, don't seem to care much. That's one advantage in being a mule. I will be glad to get back to civilization, and so will your Uncle Jim, I fancy. Take it all together, I don't think he's enjoyed watching the success of Jefferson Worth's little experiments as much as we have. The same beneficent power that has knocked out the company seems to have taken good care of friend Jeff." "You're not going to stay in the West?" asked the engineer. "I go Monday. I understand there is still a demand for good mules back home." The president of the wrecked company received his former chief engineer warmly and heartily congratulated him on the success of his battle with the river. "I suppose you know, Willard," he said, "that the Kings Basin Land and Irrigation Company has virtually passed into the hands of the S&C. We owe them a good $500,000 for closing the break, which means that they will have to take over the property. We knew when we went into the deal how it would end, of course. If you had remained with the company, the river never would have had a chance to get in at all." The younger man did not remind Mr. Greenfield of the many times the company had been urged to make the improvements that would have prevented the disaster, nor did he suggest that he would have remained with the company had not the president himself discharged him. "Your engineer did all any man could do after the break was made," he said warmly. "It was the equipment and organization of the S&C that put the river back in its channel, and no other power on earth, under the circumstances, could have done it in time to head off that back cut." The older man smiled. "We all know who closed the break, my boy. I suppose you're planning to stay with the railroad? They've offered me the management of the irrigation work here in the basin. They're going to put in permanent structures and reconstruct the whole system in first-class shape. And you accept it?" There was a note of anxiety in the older man's voice. "Not yet. I asked for a few days to consider." James Greenfield did not speak for several minutes. Then he said, hesitating as if searching for words, "Don't do it, Willard. Don't do it, for my sake. Let's go back home. You know how I hate this cursed country. I ought never to have gone into this deal after what I had already suffered in the West. But it looked as if I could clean up a good thing and get out. Personally, my money losses don't amount to anything. I have enough left for both of us, and you know, Willard, my boy, that it's all yours when I go. Come back home with me and leave this damned hole. We don't fit in here. Let's go back where we belong. I'm coming along now to the time when I must begin to think of getting out of the game, and I need you, my boy. I need you." Willard Holmes was strongly moved by the appeal of this man for whom he had a son's affection. "I wish I could say yes, Uncle Jim," he answered. "I owe you more than I can ever repay, and if it was only the work here, I would go. But there's something else, something that I cannot give up if I would, that I have no right to give up." "You mean that girl? I thought that was all settled." "So did I," returned the other grimly. "When I talked with you about it, I thought there was no possible chance for me. And perhaps I was right. But I can't let it go now without absolute certainty." "You don't mean, Willard, that you're going to offer yourself to a woman whose love you have every reason to think belongs to another man?" The engineer rose to his feet and walked up and down the room. When he spoke, there was in his voice a suggestion of that which marked his speech in the days of the river fight. "I mean this, that no man on earth shall take this woman from me if I can prevent it. I would deserve to lose her if I gave her up on the mere guess that she cared for another man. I'm going to know from her own words. If there's still a chance for me, I'm going to stay and fight for it. If I have no chance," he dropped into a chair, "then I'll go back with you, Uncle Jim." James Greenfield's face flushed hotly at the younger man's words, and then, in the silence that followed, grew pale and stern, while his fingers gripped his pencil nervously. "Very well, Willard," he said at last. "You're a man and your own master. If your love for me cannot influence you—" "Uncle Jim!" The engineer's cry was a protest and an appeal. But the other continued as though he had not heard. "I can urge no more consideration. But you must understand this. I will never receive this nameless woman of unknown parentage as your wife. If you prefer her with that illiterate, low, cunning trickster whom she calls father, you need never expect to come back to me. I have been true to your mother in my care for you. I've done all in my power to give you the place in life that you are entitled to fill by your birth and family. You've been my son in everything but blood. But by God, sir, if you, with your breeding and raising, if you can turn your back upon the memory of your mother and father and upon me and all that we stand for, if you can turn your back upon us, desert us for these damned cattle, you can herd with them the rest of your life." He was on his feet now, pacing the floor angrily. The engineer had also risen and stood waiting for this storm of wrath to spend itself. "Understand me," the older man continued. "If she refuses you, you can come back. If she accepts you, you need never show your face to me again, and I shall take good care that your friends at home understand the reason. Probably if you let these people know what the result will be if you are accepted, it will make a great difference in the woman's answer." Willard Holmes dared not speak. Nothing but his lifelong love for the man whose devotion to the engineer's mother had stood the test of years enabled the younger man to control himself. When he could speak calmly, he said, "I am sorry, sir, that you said that, for you must see how you have made it impossible for me now ever to go back with you. If Miss Worth does not care for me, I would have been glad to go home with you, for next to her, Uncle Jim, you are more to me than anyone in the world. When you say that my relation to you shall depend upon her answer, you make it impossible for her answer to make any difference as far as you and I are concerned. Won't you reconsider, Uncle Jim? Won't you take back your words?" "No, sir. I've said exactly what I mean." "Goodbye, sir." "Goodbye." When the office door had closed behind the engineer, James Greenfield stood motionless in the center of the room. Once he took a step toward the door, but checked himself. Then, turning slowly, wearily, he sank into the chair before his desk. For a few moments he fumbled aimlessly over the papers and documents, then from his pocket took a flat leather case and, opening it, held in his hand a portrait of the engineer's mother. As he looked at the face of the woman who had never ceased to hold the first place in his heart, his lips framed the words he could not speak aloud. Slowly his form drooped, his head bowed. Then, with the picture held close, he buried his face in his arms among the business papers on his desk. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of The Winning of Barbara Worth by Harold Bell Wright. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 36, Out of the Hollow of God's Hand. The first train from Republic to Barbara over the new Kings Basin Central arrived in the town by the old Dry River crossing shortly after noon. Later in the day, Jefferson Worth, with his daughter, his superintendent, and the seer, went to the power plant on the bank of Dry River. When the plant was built, it was placed as low in the old wash as the depth of the ancient channel would permit, so that the greatest possible fall from the company canal above might be secured. As Jefferson Worth and his companions stood now on the bank of the river, they saw the wasteway from the turbine wheel that ran the generators nearly 30 feet above the bottom of the channel. The flood that had cut the deep canyons through the heart of the basin, destroying Kingston on its course, had worked on a smaller scale in the old Dry River wash, cutting a narrow gorge nearly 50 feet deep from its outlet at the New Sea past the power plant at Barbara and nearly to the spillway of the main canal. Standing almost on the very spot where they had found the baby girl years before, the seer asked Barbara's father, "Jeff, does your contract with the Kings Basin Land and Irrigation Company call for a certain amount of water, or for water to develop a certain amount of power?" Jefferson Worth answered in his careful, exact voice, "The first contract calls for water to develop a certain amount of power. This new one is a contract for 300,000 inches of water. There's nothing in it about the amount of power, but it gives me the sole rights to put the power privileges on the company property. You see, when Greenfield tried to change the line of their canal so as to cut me out, Abe and I had begun to figure that someday the water from the spillway might cut down the channel and give us a little more drop. But we never counted on this, of course. I simply figured that I might just as well make the new contract safe. The seer smiled. You made it safe, all right, Jeff. Do you know what this cut means to you? In a way, yes. That's why I wanted you to look at it. It means, said the seer, that you have rights here worth $1 million at least. By lowering your turbine to the bottom of this cut, you can, with the same amount of water that you're now using, develop power enough to run every electric light system and turn every wheel in all the Kings Basin for years to come. You mean that the river breaking in and doing this has made Daddy's property worth $1 million? Asked Barbara breathlessly. The seer turned toward her. Yes, Barbara, the same force that destroyed Kingston and wrecked the company has increased the value of your father's holding to fully that amount. $1 million is very conservative. The young woman looked down into the gorge at their feet. Slowly she said, The Indians must be right. This must be indeed La Palma de la Mano de Dios. Such things could happen nowhere else. She had just finished speaking when the sound of wheels behind caused them to turn toward the desert and the old San Felipe Trail. It was Texas and Pat in the buckboard with El Capitan leading behind. Catching sight of the group on the riverbank, the men turned aside from the road and went to them. Howdy, folks, drawled Tex. We allowed we'd just about meet up with you all somewhere about here. Sure, 'tis a family reunion we do be having, with no empty chairs at all, declared the Irishman, looking from face to face with twinkling eyes. Well, well, who'd have thought now that the little kid we found under the bank here, scared of the coyotes and more scared of us roughnecks, would have growed up like this? And when me a-swearing by all the saints I knew that I would never set foot on the desert again. Here we are once more all together, with Barbara and Abe bigger than life. 'Tis the dang old desert itself that's a-having never to come back at all. He drew the back of his huge, hairy hand across his eyes. Barbara's eyes, too, were wet, and the others turned away their faces. Pat's words had recalled so vividly the scene at the dry water hole with the changes that the years had brought both to them and to the desert. It was Texas Joe who broke the silence. Mr. Worth, Pat and I would like to see you sometime this evening, if you ain't engaged. What is it, Tex? As he spoke, Jefferson Worth looked straight into the eyes of the old plainsman. Texas Joe, gazing steadily into the face of his employer, drawled easily. Just a little matter we allowed maybe you would like to know about, sir. What time shall we come? Something, the memories of the place perhaps aroused by the words of Pat a moment before, caused Jefferson Worth to lift those nervous fingers and slowly caress his chin. I guess I can go now. We're all through here. He turned to the others. I'll go on to the hotel with Tex and Pat, and you folks can come along later when you're ready. He stepped into the buckboard and with the two drove away. At a livery barn where they stopped to leave the horses, Texas took from under the seat of the buckboard something that was wrapped in a sack that had held a feed of grain for the team and El Capitan. When they had reached the privacy of Mr. Worth's room, the old plainsman and the Irishman stood as if each waited for the other to begin. Well, men, said Jefferson Worth, what is it? Go on, you old oyster, growled Pat to Tex. Why the hell don't you tell the boss what we come to tell him? Speak up." Texas Joe cleared his throat and began formally. "I don't reckon, Mr. Worth, that you all has forgot that outfit we left in them sand hills back yonder on the old San Felipe trail the time we found the kid." At the words, Jefferson Worth's face became a gray mask from behind which his mind reached out as though to grasp what Texas would say before the man put it into words. "Well?" The single word came with the colorless sound of dull metal. "Also, I reckon you know them big drifts are always on the move, so that when they covers up anything, say an outfit like that one, it stands to reason that someday they'll drift on and leave it clear again." Jefferson Worth's hands were gripping the arms of his chair. His gray lips could frame no sound. "I always kind of kept an eye on that there particular ridge," continued Texas. "And so today me and Pat stopped for a little look around, and—" Slowly he unwrapped the grain sack from a long tin box. "And we found this." He laid the box carefully on the table before Barbara's father. "It was a lay-in with what was left of a bigger wooden box or trunk, which same had gone to pieces, and there was a part of that old wagon with that same piece of a halter strap you remember fastened to a wheel. There ain't no sort of doubt, Mr. Worth, that it's the same outfit, and it's mighty likely that there's papers in here that'll tell us what we tried so hard to find out at first. But what—" He paused and looked around, then finished in a low tone, "I don't reckon any of us wants to know now." Jefferson Worth sat motionless in his chair, his eyes fixed upon the tin box. The heavy voice of the Irishman broke the quiet. "If Tex would have listened to reason, sir, I'd have dumped the dang thing into the river, saying nothing to nobody. For what good can it do raking up the past that's dead and gone? The girl is as much yours as if she was your own flesh and blood. And who can say what devil's own mess may come out of this thing? Leave it alone, I say, and for what nobody don't know can't hurt him. 'Twas wrong entirely to bring it up to you, after all you've been such a father to the little one. Leave it to me, sir. Give me the word, and I'll—" He reached eagerly for the box, but Jefferson Worth held up his slim, nervous hand. "Wait a moment, Pat. I don't think that would be right." Never before had these men seen Jefferson Worth hesitate. The will of the man, whose cold decision had carried him through so many critical situations and upon which the pioneers had relied in the recent time of peril, seemed to fail him at last. The spectacle told the men more clearly than words could have done what he suffered. I don't know what to do," he finished weakly. "Give me time. Let me think." He bowed his head in his hands. Pat growled an oath under his breath, and Texas turned his eyes from his companions to the box, and from the box back to his friends in bewildered uncertainty. At last he said in his soft Southern drawl, "Mr. Worth, it's dead sure that me and Pat ain't helping you none in this. I reckon I was all wrong to bring it to you at all, but it seemed like I was plumb balled up, and it couldn't rightly say what was best. There ain't really no call to crowd this thing, as I can see. Suppose you takes your time to think it over. Me and Pat'll let you alone, and if you decides to forget all about it, you can bet your last red we'll be damn glad to help. Nobody but us three will ever know. 'Tain't as if it was a-doing anybody any harm." Jefferson Worth raised his head. "Thank you, boys," he said. "I'll have to figure on this thing a little." Left alone, Jefferson Worth faced the temptation of his life. Dearer to this lonely-hearted man than all the wealth and power that he would realize from his King's Basin work was the child who had come to him out of the desert. The man knew that it was the influence of Barbara upon his life that had prepared him for that night in the sandhills and enabled him rightly to weigh and measure and value the efforts of his kind. That afternoon at the powerhouse, it had all been brought before him with startling vividness. He felt that in all that he had accomplished in Barbara's desert, he had been led by the child who had come to him out of the hollow of God's hand. The desert had given her to him. He had given himself in return to the work she loved. He could not think of his work apart from her. She was his. His. His gray lips whispered the words as he stood looking down at the box. No one had the right to take her from him, to come into her life. And yet. He reached out and laid his hand upon the box, then, turning again, paced the room. Suddenly he whirled about and approached the table. With cold fury he seized the box, and placing it upon the floor, broke the light tin fastening with his boot heel. Again he paused and looked dully at the thing in his hands. Then, with a quick motion, he threw up the cover. The box was filled with documents and letters, with 4 or 5 old photographs. The address on the large unsealed envelope met his eye, and he started back with a low cry as though he had looked upon some startling apparition. When Barbara, with the seer and Abe, returned to the hotel that evening, the clerk gave her a note from her father, who, the note explained, had been called to Republic on business of importance. He would be back tomorrow. The clerk said that Mr. Worth had left only a few minutes before, with the engine and car that had brought them to Barbara that morning. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of The Winning of Barbara Worth by Harold Bell Wright. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 37. Back to the old San Felipe Trail. In the office of the Kings Basin Land and Irrigation Company, James Greenfield was aroused by a knock at the door. He lifted his head from his arms and looked around as if awakened out of a deep sleep. Another knock, and he slipped the picture he held in his hand into his pocket and called, "Come in." The door opened, and Jefferson Worth stepped into the room. For a moment, the president of the wrecked company sat staring at his business rival. Then he leaped to his feet, his fist clenched and his face working with passion. "You can't come in here, sir. Get out," he said with the voice and manner he would have assumed in speaking to a trespassing dog. Jefferson Worth stood still. "I have business of importance with you, Mr. Greenfield," he said, and his air of quiet dignity contrasted strangely with the rage of the larger man. "You can have no business with me of any sort whatever. I have nothing to do with your kind. This is my private office. I tell you to get out." Jefferson Worth turned calmly as though to obey, but instead of leaving the room, closed the door and locked it. Then, placing the small grip he carried upon the table, he deliberately went close to the threatening president and said coldly, "This is rank nonsense, Greenfield. I won't leave this office until I'm through with what I came to do. I have business with you that concerns you as much as it does me. You're a damn thief, a low sharper. I tell you I have nothing to do with you. Now get out or I'll throw you out." Jefferson Worth answered in his exact, precise manner as though carefully choosing and considering his words. "No, you won't throw me out. You'll listen to what I have come to tell you. The rest of your statement, Greenfield, is false, and you know it. It will be just as well for you not to repeat it." The last low-spoken words did not appear to be uttered as a threat, but as a calm statement of a carefully considered fact. James Greenfield felt as a man who permits himself to rage against an immovable obstacle, as one who spends his strength cursing a stone wall that bars his way or a rock that lies in his path. With an effort, he regained a measure of his self-control. "Well, out with it. What do you want?" "Sit down," said Worth, pointing to a chair. Mechanically, the other obeyed. "You have no reason for taking this attitude toward me, Mr. Greenfield," began Worth with his air of simply stating a fact. At his words, the wrath of the other again mastered him. "No reason? You dare to tell me that, when you and the young woman that you call your daughter have come between me and the boy who is more than a son to me? When you've broken our close relationship of years' standing and robbed me of his companionship? When you've wrecked and ruined all my plans for his future? When you've defeated the object of my life? No reason? But what can you understand of us? You're a nobody, sir, without a place or a name in the world. A common, low-bred, ignorant sharper with no family but a nameless daughter of unknown parentage whom you found on the desert. How can you understand what Willard Holmes is to me?" "I figured that you would feel this way about it," came the colorless words. "That's what I came here for tonight, to fix it up." The angry amazement of Greenfield at what he considered the man's presumption could find no expression. Worth continued, "I know a great deal more about you and your folks than you think. When I saw that He hesitated over the word, then spoke it plainly. "My daughter was becoming interested in Willard Holmes. I took some pains to look up his history. In doing that, I naturally found out a good deal about you. Later, I learned a good deal more." "It is immaterial to me what you know," muttered the other in a tone of deep disgust. "What do you want?" Worth spoke with quiet dignity. "I want you to understand first, Mr. Greenfield, that my girl is just as much to me as young Holmes is to you. You are right. I'm a nobody, ignorant and all that. But you must not think, Mr. Greenfield, that because you belong in New York and I belong in the West, that this thing is harder for you than it is for me. You're not going to lose your boy. But I—" For the first time he hesitated, and his voice expressed emotion. "I'm going to lose my girl." The pathos of this lonely man's words touched even Greenfield. His manner was more gentle as he said gruffly, "It's a bad business, Mr. Worth, a damned bad business for both of us. I wish I'd never heard of this country." "You'll feel different about that. Anyway, I figured that this country and this work will be here long after you and I are gone, and so will these young people." Again he hesitated, and his slim fingers caressed his chin. Then from behind that gray mask he asked, "How much do you know about our finding Barbara in the desert?" "I know the story in a general way, that's all. It does not interest me." "Let me tell you the facts." In his brief, colorless sentences, Jefferson Worth related the incidents of that trip across the desert, and as he did so, Greenfield began to realize that some powerful motive had brought this man to him and was forcing him to relate his story with such exact care for the details. "And you never found the slightest clue, even to the child's name?" he asked when Worth had finished. Jefferson Worth hesitated. Then, "Mr. Greenfield, you had a younger brother who came west." The man gazed at the speaker in amazement as he answered mechanically, "Yes, he died out here somewhere, in California, I believe. I was never able to learn the details. He was an adventurous lad and a good deal of a rover. But why? How? As the full import of the question dawned upon him, Greenfield started from his seat. My God, man, you cannot mean that it was my brother Will who was lost in that sandstorm on the desert? That the woman you found by the water hole was his wife Gertrude? And that his voice sank to a whisper. Will wrote me that there was a child, that she had Gertrude's hair and eyes. I had never seen her. He turned fiercely upon his companion. And you have kept this from me all these years? You've kept my only brother's child from me? By God, sir, But perhaps this is all one of your damnable tricks. What proof have you that this is so? And if it is, why have you kept it a secret? Jefferson Worth opened his satchel and laid the tin box on the desk before the president of the Kings Basin Land and Irrigation Company. This box was found this afternoon by Texas Joe and Pat, who brought it to me. I opened it. It's all here. When Greenfield had examined the contents of the box, letters, some of them written by himself to his brother, papers relating to William Greenfield's business affairs and property, and photographs of the little family and of the two brothers and their parents, he looked up to see Jefferson Worth sitting motionless, his form relaxed, his head dropped forward. Suddenly, the words of the man who had been a father to his brother's child came back to Greenfield. My girl is just as much to me as young Holmes is to you. You're not going to lose your boy, but I'm going to lose my girl. In a flash, the financier saw it all, saw how Jefferson Worth loved Barbara as his own child, as Greenfield cared for Willard Holmes, saw how Worth might have destroyed the papers so strangely brought to light and kept the secret, saw and realized a little what strength of character it had taken to overcome the temptation, and felt what the man was suffering. As Greenfield's hand fell on his shoulder, Jefferson Worth slowly lifted his head. Slowly he rose to his feet. In silence the two men faced each other. Without a word, for no word was needed, their hands met in a firm grip. After a little while, Greenfield said eagerly, "Where is she now, Mr. Worth? Where is the girl? Does she know? I must see her at once. Come. And Willard, I wonder if he's still in town. Come, we must go to them." But Jefferson Worth answered, "I've been figuring on that, Mr. Greenfield. You had better let me tell Barbara myself. And if I was you, after what you have probably said to Holmes on this subject, I wouldn't be in a hurry to tell him. For the sake of their future, we'd better let Barbara handle that matter herself. You can easily figure it out that it will be best for them that way." End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of The Winning of Barbara Worth by Harold Bell Wright. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 38, The Heritage of Barbara Worth. Barbara, walking quickly, left the little village and crossing Dry River on the bridge that now spanned the deep gorge where the old San Felipe trail once led down into the ancient wash, climbed the slight grade to the grave that was marked by the simple headstone with its one word, Mother. That morning Jefferson Worth had told her of the tin box found by Texas Joe and Pat. With reverent care she had read the papers and letters, and had looked long at the portraits of her parents and people. She could not at first realize that the desert had at last given up the secret that she had so longed to know. It was not real to her. The revelation was so sudden, so startling. She could not think of herself save as the daughter of Jefferson Worth, whom she loved as a father. As soon as the noonday meal was over, she had left her room in the hotel, and once out of doors her steps had instinctively turned toward her mother's grave beside the old trail. Standing before the headstone, she looked at the one word, Mother. She said softly, Mother. Then, still in a whisper, she repeated the unfamiliar names, Gertrude Greenfield, William Greenfield, my mother, my father. I am Barbara Greenfield, Barbara Greenfield. Seating herself on the ground beside the grave, she looked about, at the sand hills in the distance, at the dry river gorge and the power plant, at the canals shining like silver bands among the green fields of the ranchers to the southeast, and at the little town. An hour passed, then another and another. Across the river she saw Pablo riding out of the town and away along the road that follows the canal. Then from the powerhouse came Abe Lee with the seer. She watched them as they walked along the bank of the old channel. Once she thought she would call to them, but hesitated. If they crossed the bridge and came up the hill, they would be sure to see her. So she waited, keeping still. They passed the bridge and continued on down the bank of the stream. Barbara knew instinctively that they were talking of her and the secret that the desert had at last revealed, for she had asked her father to tell them. She thought of her father, who had gone to Republic. He would return that evening, and Mr. Greenfield, her uncle, would be with him. Her uncle! How strange! Then Barbara saw on the other side of the river a horseman riding from the south toward the town. She could not mistake the khaki-clad figure that, while fully at home in the saddle, still lacked the indescribable easy looseness and swinging grace of the Western rider. It was Willard Holmes, and the young woman's heart told her why the engineer had come. Since that meeting at the river, in the hour of his victory, she had known that he would come, and she had known what her answer would be. He had evidently ridden from the river, from his work. Did he know? No, she decided. He could not know yet. Then the quick thought came. He must not know until she herself should tell him. Quickly the young woman walked down the hill across the bridge toward the town. Willard Holmes arrived at the hotel and, learning that Miss Worth was out, carried a chair to the arcade on the street to await her return. He had not waited long when a voice at his shoulder said with mock formality, "I believe this is Mr. Willard Holmes." The engineer sprang to his feet. "Miss Worth, they told me that you were out. I was sitting here waiting for you." "I was out when you arrived," she confessed, "but I saw you coming and hurried back pronto. I knew you had just left the river, you see. And of course," she added, as though that explained her eagerness to see him, "I wanted to hear the latest news from the work." "There's no news," he answered, as though dismissing the matter finally. "And may I ask what brings you to Barba?" He looked at her steadily. "You brought me to Barba." "I?" "Yes, you. I stopped in Republic on my way back from the city the evening of the day you left. I was forced to go on to the river, but took the first opportunity to ride out here, for I understood you expected to be in Barba several days. Surely you know why I've come. The work I stayed in the basin to do is finished. I have another offer from the S&C which, if I accept, will keep me here for several years. I have come to you with it as I came with the other. What shall I do? Please don't pretend that you don't understand me." The direct forcefulness of the man almost made Barbara forget the little plan she had arranged on her way to the hotel to meet him. "I won't pretend, Mr. Holmes," she answered seriously. "But will you go with me for a little ride into the desert?" Her words recalled to his mind instantly their first meeting in Rubio City, but Holmes was not astonished now. The invitation coming from Barbara under the circumstances seemed the most natural thing in the world. The young woman went to her room to make ready, while the engineer brought the horses, and in a very few minutes they had crossed the river and were following the old San Felipe trail toward the sand hills. Very few words passed between them until they reached the great drift that had held so long its secret. Leaving the horses at Barbara's request, they climbed the steep sides of the great sand mound. From the top they could see on every hand the many miles of the Kings Basin country, from Lone Mountain at the end of the Delta Dam to the snow-capped sentinels of San Antonio Pass, and from the skyline of the mesa and the low hills on the east to No Man's Mountains and the bold wall of the Coast Range that shuts out the beautiful country on the west. The soft, many-colored veils and scarfs of the desert, with the gold of the sand hills, the purple of the mountains, the gray and green of the desert vegetation, with the ragged patches of dun plain, were all there still, as when Willard Holmes had first looked upon it, for the work of reclamation was still far from finished. But there was more in Barbara's desert now than pictures woven magically in the air. There were beautiful scenes of farms with houses and barns and fences and stacks, with cattle and horses in the pastures, and fields of growing grain, the dark green of alfalfa, with threads and lines and spots of water that under the flood of white light from the wide sky shone in the distance like gleaming silver. Barbara and the engineer could even distinguish the little towns of Republic and Frontera, with Barba nearby. And even as they looked, they marked the tall column of smoke from the locomotive of the S&C, moving toward the crossing of the old San Felipe Trail, and on the Kings Basin Central another, coming toward the town on Dry River, where once beside a dry water hole a woman lay dead with an empty canteen by her side. Willard Holmes drew a long breath. "You like my desert?" asked the young woman softly, coming closer to his side, so close that he felt her presence as clearly as he felt the presence of the spirit that lives in the desert itself. "Like it?" he repeated, turning toward her. "It is my desert now, mine as well as yours. Oh, Barbara, Barbara, I've learned the language of your land. Must I leave it now? Won't you tell me to stay?" He held out his hands to her, but she drew back a little from his eagerness. "Wait. I must know something first before I can answer." He looked at her questioningly. "What must you know, Barbara?" "Did you ever hear the story of what happened here in these very sand hills? Do you know that I am not the daughter of Jefferson Worth?" "Yes," he answered gravely. "I know that Mr. Worth is not your own father, but I did not know that this was the scene of the tragedy." "And you understand that I am nameless, that no one knows my parentage, that there may even be Mexican or Indian blood in my veins? You understand? You realize all that?" He started toward her almost roughly. "Yes, I understand all that, but I care only that you are Barbara. I know only that I want you. You, Barbara." "But your family, Mr. Greenfield, your friends back home, think what it means to them. Can you afford—" "Barbara," he cried, "stop! Why are you saying these things? Listen to me. Don't you know that I love you? Don't you know that nothing else matters? Your desert has taught me many things, dear, but nothing so great as this, that I want you and that nothing else matters. I want you for my wife." "But you said once that you would never marry me," persisted the young woman. "What has changed you?" "I said that I would never marry you? I said that? That cannot be, Barbara. You are mistaken." She shook her head. "That is what you said. I heard you myself. You told Mr. Greenfield. At my house that morning he came to see you when you were hurt. I the door into the dining room was open, and I heard." The light of quick understanding broke over the engineer's face. "And you heard what Uncle Jim said to me? But, Barbara, didn't you hear the reason I gave him for saying that I would not marry you?" I couldn't hear anything after that," she said simply. At her confession, the man's strong face shone with triumph. "Listen, dear, I told Uncle Jim I would never marry you because you loved someone else and that there was no chance for me." Barbara's brown eyes opened wide. "You thought that?" "Yes, I thought you loved Abe Lee." Why, I do love Abe." The man laughed. "Of course you do, but I thought you loved him as I wanted you to love me. Don't you understand?" "Oh!" The exclamation was a confession, an explanation, and an expression of complete understanding. "But that," she added as she went to him, "that could not be." And then, but Barbara's words, rightly understood, mark the end of my story. Rarely is it given in the story of life to those who work greatly or love greatly to gather the fruit of their toil or passion. But it is given those others, perhaps, those for whom it could not be, to know a happiness greater, it may be, than the joy of possession. End of chapter 38. End The Winning of Barbara Worth. Recording by Bob Rollins in Augusta, Georgia.